The militia of farmers who humiliated the British Empire at Cowpens. On January 17, 1781, something happened on a cattle grazing field in South Carolina that British military strategists spent decades trying to explain away, and most of them never could. An army of militia soldiers who had never heard the word discipline from a drill sergeant defeated one of the Crown's most aggressive field commanders using tactics that violated every principle of conventional 18th century warfare. But here's the part that changes everything. They didn't do it by accident, and they didn't do it because they suddenly became professional soldiers. They won because they understood something about themselves that the British command structure could not even comprehend. And I'm going to show you exactly what that realization was. Because at the end of this story, you're going to understand why citizen soldiers have always been the Crown's most dangerous adversary. If you're watching this channel, you already know that Cowpens was a victory. But I want to know, have you ever thought about why? It matters now? Drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think makes a militia unit more dangerous than a professional army? I'm genuinely curious what brought you here. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we dig into stories that the mainstream historical channels completely ignore, and this one is going to shift how you understand American military culture forever. Wait, before we go further, this is critical. If you want to understand not just what happened at Cowpens, but why the militia's approach worked when it should have failed according to every military textbook of that era, we've published a complete in-depth guide on the mechanics of militia tactics in the Revolutionary War. It's in the description and pinned in the comments. That guide breaks down the actual formations, the psychology of frontier fighters, and the specific reasons why conventional armies kept underestimating them. It's required reading if you're serious about this history. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 1780. The American Revolution had been grinding on for 5 years, and by the time the British shifted their strategy to the south, most people in the Carolina backcountry thought the war was already lost. They weren't wrong to think it. General Sir Henry Clinton had sailed south that May with over 14,000 troops and a full naval fleet. His target was Charleston, the economic heart of the southern colonies. He surrounded it completely. No escape routes, no supply lines getting through. General Benjamin Lincoln commanded the American defenders, and they held out as long as they could behind their fortifications. But by May 12th, they surrendered the entire garrison. 5,000 American soldiers captured in one stroke. It was the worst American military disaster until Bataan in 1942. After that, Lord Cornwallis, the general left in command of the Southern Theater, pushed inland with absolute confidence. He established a chain of fortified posts stretching from the coast into the backcountry. Loyalist families were organized and armed. Rebel sympathizers were given a choice: swear an oath to the crown or lose everything. The British believed they had finally broken American resistance in the South. They thought the war was over. Then came August 16, 1780. Cornwallis faced General Horatio Gates and the hastily assembled Southern Continental Army at Camden, South Carolina. Gates was famous. He had defeated a British general at Saratoga years earlier. But at Camden, everything fell apart. The American militia broke and ran almost immediately. Gates himself fled on horseback and didn't stop riding for nearly 60 miles. Almost 1,000 Americans killed or captured. After Camden, there was no organized Continental Army left in the South to speak of. For the next 4 months, the British owned the Carolinas. They executed rebel sympathizers. They burned homes that had harbored patriots. They pressed loyalist militia into aggressive patrols to hunt down any remaining Continental soldiers. The southern backcountry was in chaos. Villages burned, families scattered, and nowhere was safe if you had sided with the revolution. Cornwallis ordered his officers to expand their control deeper into the frontier. He sent columns out to destroy supplies, capture rebels, and enforce Crown authority. One of these columns was commanded by a Scottish officer named Major Patrick Ferguson. Now, Ferguson was not an ordinary officer. He was a marksman, one of the finest in the entire British Army. He had invented his own breech-loading rifle, a weapon decades ahead of its time. He had personally trained over 1,000 loyalist militia to fight with bayonets and discipline. He had spent months terrorizing the Carolina backcountry, burning settlements that supported the revolution and executing militia leaders. In British dispatches, he was praised as aggressive, efficient, and utterly ruthless. He had never lost a battle. But in September 1780, Ferguson made a critical decision. He had heard reports of a force of militia from west of the mountains, the backcountry beyond the ridge. These were frontier riflemen, men who had fought in wars against Native American tribes, men who had no formal training and no uniform and no connection to the Continental Army. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. Ferguson was confident enough in his position and scornful enough of militia tactics that he sent a message to them. That message would change everything. The message said something like this. Ferguson warned the mountain men that if they took up arms against him, he would march across the mountains, lay waste to their country, and hang their leaders. He promised to lay waste to their country with fire and sword. Ferguson believed these frontier militia would be intimidated. He was certain they would stand down. Instead, he had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his military career, and he was about to learn why frontier fighters operated according to principles that professional soldiers simply could not understand. The backcountry militia did not answer Ferguson's threat with submission, they answered with action. Within weeks, frontiersmen from what is now Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina began organizing. They sent messages by rider across ridges and through valleys. They called for men to meet at a place called Sycamore Shoals. Farmers left their fields. Traders left their stores. Hunters left their camps. By the time the militia force began assembling, nearly 1,000 armed men had answered the call. And they were not coming to negotiate or surrender. They were coming to destroy Ferguson and his army. This is where the conventional military narrative completely breaks down. These frontier militia had no generals. They had no army supply lines. They had no uniforms, no commissariat, no artillery train. They had rifles, horses, and an absolute determination that Ferguson would not intimidate them. When they rode east toward Ferguson's position, they were not following orders from Congress. They were not answering to the Continental Army's high command. They were following an impulse that was perhaps even older than the revolution itself, the impulse to defend their homes, their families, and their way of life against an outside force trying to control them. And here is what Ferguson and the British command did not comprehend. These men were not soldiers pretending to be militia. They were militia who understood themselves and each other in ways that professional armies could never replicate. Every man in that force had hunted on his own land. Every man knew how to move through rough terrain. Every man understood how to aim and fire a rifle with precision, because hunting was not a skill for him, it was survival. And every man had a personal stake in the outcome that went far beyond military honor or crown allegiance. Ferguson was threatening their homes. What happened next would set the stage for one of the most misunderstood battles in American history, a battle that proved something that professional military theorists are still struggling to accept even today. But before we dive into that confrontation, I need you to understand the deeper mechanism at work here. The guide I mentioned earlier, the complete one on militia tactics and the psychological edge that citizen soldiers possess over professional armies, that guide goes into the specific ways that Ferguson and Cornwallis completely misjudged their opponent. It explains the actual formations used at Cowpens, the why behind each decision, and the historical pattern that keeps repeating itself. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment. This is the material that gives you the real context. On January 16, 1781, Ferguson and his army, about 1,100 men, mostly loyalist militia under his command, were moving south when scouts reported that the Patriot militia force was approaching. And Ferguson was not concerned. He had faced militia before. He believed that his training, his discipline, and his breech-loading rifles would be more than sufficient to crush these frontier fighters in open battle. He moved his force to a ridge near the Cowpens area. On January 17th, he sent out a detachment to scout the militia's position. What came back was a report that changed Ferguson's confidence into something resembling alarm. The militia had arrived faster than expected. They were not marching in a column. They were spread out across the landscape, moving in coordinated smaller groups, using the terrain to mask their numbers and their approach. To Ferguson, this looked like an undisciplined mob. To anyone who understood backcountry fighting, it looked like an army that knew exactly what it was doing. Ferguson drew up his force on the ridge, believing that the high ground and his discipline would be overwhelming advantages. He was about to learn that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy he was facing. Ferguson's mistake was believing that the militia were like every other force he had ever faced. They were not. These were not Continental regulars trained in European tactics. These were men who had hunted in these forests their entire lives. Men who knew how to move through broken terrain without being seen. Men who understood that every shot mattered because ammunition was expensive and game did not give a second chance. Their rifles, long, accurate, and capable of hitting a target at ranges where British muskets became nearly useless, were tools they had mastered since childhood, not weapons they had been issued and told to carry. The men surrounding Ferguson that October morning were led by commanders whose names have been nearly erased from the popular memory of the American Revolution. William Campbell was a militia colonel from what is now Tennessee, a fierce, determined man who had fought alongside these frontier soldiers before. Benjamin Cleveland, a towering figure who claimed to be German-born but fought with the raw intensity of a man defending his own land. Andrew Pickens, a skilled tactician whose family had already lost property and relatives to British and Loyalist raids. Isaac Shelby, barely 30 years old, but already recognized as a natural leader of irregular forces. These men were not playing at warfare. They were fighting for survival. And they brought something else to the battlefield that morning, a clear tactical purpose. They did not intend to stand and exchange volleys like European armies did. Their entire approach was built on movement, firepower, and terrain. The militia understood instinctively, or perhaps through generations of frontier experience, that the best way to defeat a disciplined force with bayonets was to not be there when the bayonet charge came. This was not cowardice, this was survival. This was the only way a force of civilian marksmen could defeat trained soldiers with armor and superior close-quarters weapons. The battle itself, if you can call what happened in 65 minutes a battle, unfolded not as a clash of armies meeting head-on, but as something closer to a calculated execution. The militia opened fire from the edges of the clearing, staying in the tree line and behind natural cover. Ferguson immediately ordered his loyalist troops to charge down the ridge with bayonets fixed, trusting in the discipline and courage that he had trained into them. It was the correct response according to European military doctrine. It was precisely the wrong response against enemies who had no intention of standing still to receive it. As the British and Loyalist soldiers advanced down the slope with bayonets leveled, the militia simply withdrew into the woods. They did not run in panic. They fell back in disciplined groups, reloading as they moved, maintaining fire as they retreated. The moment the charging soldiers reached the tree line and began to clash with the militia in close quarters, other militia groups would surge forward from different angles. It was a dance of violence and timing that Ferguson's men could not counter. The bayonets that were supposed to be an overwhelming advantage became nearly useless against an enemy that refused to stand in front of them. The killing ground expanded with each cycle. Ferguson's army was being compressed into a smaller and smaller space. His ammunition was running low. His men were falling faster than new waves of charging could replace. For a commander trained in conventional European warfare, this must have felt like drowning. Every tactic that should have worked was failing. Every assumption he had made about how warfare operated was being shattered by men in homespun cloth who fought like they were defending their own homes, which they were. Ferguson himself died in the final moments of the fighting, shot from his horse by militia riflemen. Some accounts say it took multiple shots. Some say a single fatal wound. All accounts agree that by the time he fell, the outcome was no longer in doubt. His army was breaking. Surrender was coming. The question was no longer whether the militia would win. It was only how many men would die before the inevitable conclusion. Before we continue, and this is critical to understanding what happened next, I need you to keep something in mind. The Cowpens victory was not just a military triumph. It was a signal, a message that traveled through the colonies faster than horses could carry it. The militia had done the impossible, and that revelation, the full implications of what this battle meant for the entire revolution, is something we explore in depth in our complete strategic guide to the American Revolution's turning points. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment. It breaks down not just what happened at Cowpens, but why this particular kind of tactical innovation became the template for how the American forces ultimately defeated the British. It is a paid resource, but it takes you deeper into the mechanisms that made this moment possible. Within hours of Ferguson's death, the news began to spread. The frontier militia had defeated a professional British officer and his trained force. The signal was simple but profound. The frontier would not break. The British had expected to march through the Carolinas and find the population either loyalist or too terrorized to resist. Instead, they had found something they did not know how to fight. The psychological impact on the Continental cause was immense. General Cornwallis, who had been operating with the confidence of an empire, found that confidence shaken. He could not be everywhere. He could not protect every post. He could not suppress an enemy that seemed to emerge from the forests, win battles, and then vanish back into the landscape before he could bring conventional force to bear. The loyalist recruits he was counting on began to have second thoughts. If the militia could defeat the British, perhaps supporting the crown was not the safe bet it had seemed. But the victory at Cowpens was not simply a symbolic triumph. It had immediate, concrete military consequences. The British had lost over 300 men killed or mortally wounded. Nearly 700 had been captured. More critically, they had lost a commander of significant reputation and capability. Ferguson had been considered one of the finest field officers in the British Army. His death and the destruction of his force raised a question in the minds of every other British commander. If Ferguson could be destroyed by militia, what protected them? The militia that won at Cowpens did not stay together as an army. They did not march to join the Continental forces. They did not wait for medals or recognition. Many of them simply returned to their homes. They had accomplished what they set out to do. They had stopped the invasion of the frontier. They had demonstrated that civilian soldiers, fighting on terrain they understood, against enemies using tactics designed for European battlefields, could achieve impossible victories. Then they went home to their families and their land. This is where the story becomes something more than just a military victory. The militia had proven something to themselves and to the broader revolutionary movement. Regular armies with their formations and their discipline could be defeated. British soldiers were not invincible. The American Revolution did not have to be won by the Continental Army alone. It could be won by citizens willing to take up arms and fight with the weapons and tactics they understood. In the months that followed Cowpens, the psychological momentum shifted. Cornwallis found himself operating in territory that was no longer fully under his control. The frontier militia had shown that they could strike, win, and escape. Every British outpost became potentially vulnerable. Every supply line could be attacked. The kind of war that Cornwallis wanted to fight, a straightforward campaign of occupation and pacification, was becoming impossible. William Campbell, who had coordinated much of the militia's organization and initial assault, had come from a family with deep roots in the mountain regions. His willingness to mobilize the frontier forces quickly, to send riders into the mountains and gather hundreds of men in a matter of days, had been crucial to the victory. But his story, like so many of the men who won at Cowpens, has been largely forgotten by mainstream history. He is not a household name. Most Americans who know about the Revolutionary War could not tell you who he was or what he accomplished. Benjamin Cleveland was perhaps even more extraordinary. 6 feet tall in an era when the average man was considerably shorter, fierce in temperament and capable of extraordinary violence when necessary, Cleveland had already organized militia resistance before Cowpens. He was not waiting for permission from any continental authority. He was not following orders from a distant general. He was leading because his community needed leading, and he had the strength and intelligence to do it. After Cowpens, he would continue militia operations throughout the Carolinas until the end of the war. Andrew Pickens brought a different kind of leadership. Where others were reactive or aggressive, Pickens thought tactically. He had studied how to defeat the British, and at Cowpens, his understanding of terrain and timing was evident. After the Revolutionary War, Pickens would go on to serve in the Seminole Wars and in later militia campaigns. His entire life was shaped by the experience of frontier warfare. Isaac Shelby was the youngest of the major militia commanders at Cowpens, but his leadership would extend far beyond that single battle. He would go on to become one of the founding political figures of Tennessee, recognized and honored in his time as a man of military capability. The frontier recognized his abilities and continued to follow him. These men, Campbell, Cleveland, Pickles, Shelby, did not win at Cowpens because they had been trained at West Point. There was no West Point yet. They did not win because they had been given orders by George Washington. The Continental Army was hundreds of miles away and had nothing to do with the victory. They won because they understood their terrain, they understood their weapons, and they understood that the British were trying to fight a war the way Europeans fought wars, with rigid formations and open ground, and the assumption that discipline would overcome everything. Cornwallis responded to the Cowpens defeat by doing what conventional commanders do. He pursued. He moved his army to chase down the militia and their captured prisoners and supplies. But he was pursuing an enemy that knew the terrain far better than he did. The militia, under the coordination of General Daniel Morgan, a Continental officer who had linked up with them after Cowpens, led Cornwallis on a chase that would exhaust the British army and ultimately push Cornwallis toward the coast and eventual entrapment. What makes the Cowpens victory particularly significant for the American Revolution is that it proved the viability of a different kind of warfare. It demonstrated that the rigid, formally trained European armies of the 18th century were vulnerable to enemies who refused to fight by those rules. This was not a new insight. Irregular forces have always been challenging to conventional armies. But at Cowpens, it was proven on a scale and with a clarity that reverberated through the rest of the war. The victory at Cowpens became a reference point. It became proof that the American way of war, built on individual marksmanship, knowledge of terrain, rapid movement, and the ability to concentrate and disperse quickly, could work. In later campaigns, militia commanders would explicitly reference the lessons of Cowpens. They would organize their forces along similar lines. They would employ similar tactics of withdrawal and flanking that had worked so devastatingly against Ferguson. But here is what is particularly frustrating about the historical record. The men who won at Cowpens received almost no recognition in their own time. There were no parades. There were no monuments erected. The Continental Congress did not vote them honors or pensions. George Washington, fighting his own campaigns in the North, barely acknowledged their accomplishment. The militiamen themselves received no official compensation. Many of them had to leave families and farms undefended to fight. Some of them lost everything while they were away. The historical narrative that developed after the Revolutionary War largely focused on the Continental Army, on George Washington, on the formal battles and the formal military structure. The militia were peripheral in this narrative, useful auxiliaries perhaps, but not central to the story. The men who won at Cowpens, men whose tactical innovation and courage had genuinely altered the trajectory of the war, became footnotes in the histories that were written. This erasure is particularly striking because it represents a fundamental shift in how Americans would remember their own history. The myth that developed of the Revolutionary War being won primarily by the Continental Army and George Washington became so dominant that the reality of what actually happened was gradually obscured. The frontier militia, the irregular forces, the men who understood that warfare on the American frontier followed different rules than warfare in Europe, were marginalized in the historical memory. Yet the truth is undeniable. Without the victory at Cowpens, without the militia's willingness to stand and fight, the Southern campaign might have ended very differently. Cornwallis might have succeeded in his objective of pacifying the Carolinas. The British strategy of conquering the South and using loyalist militia to maintain control might have worked. The psychological impact of the militia victory changed the calculus for everyone. For British commanders, for American civilians deciding whether to support the Continental cause, for militia everywhere who now believed that they could stand against professional armies. The aftermath of Cowpens was not the end of the story. It was a beginning. Morgan's militia did not disband. They did not return home and forget what they had accomplished. Instead, they became something the British had never encountered before, a force that understood both how to fight and when to disappear. Within days of their victory, many of the militia units melted back into the Carolina countryside, moving invisibly among the communities they knew better than any redcoat ever could. They carried news of the victory with them, spreading word through taverns and farmsteads, through churches and market squares. The message was simple but revolutionary. Frontier fighters had defeated the king's finest. Cornwallis himself was reeling. The loss of Ferguson and his militia force represented far more than tactical defeat. It represented a catastrophic breach in his strategy. The Southern Loyalists, whom he had counted on as the backbone of his campaign to pacify the Carolinas, had proven to be far less formidable than intelligence reports suggested. Some had fought well. Ferguson's militia had held their ground longer than anyone expected. But against determined militia riflemen fighting on terrain they understood, discipline and bayonets meant nothing. Cornwallis realized, perhaps for the first time, that conquest of the South would not be the swift, efficient operation London had promised. It would be grinding, costly, and uncertain. Morgan, meanwhile, understood perfectly what his victory meant. He was not a man who wasted time on celebration or self-congratulation. Within days of Cowpens, he began the most dangerous maneuver of the entire campaign, the retreat northward with Cornwallis in pursuit. This was no rout or panic-stricken flight. It was a calculated withdrawal, a masterclass in tactical movement under pressure. Morgan's force moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough for the British to concentrate their strength. He coordinated with other American units in the South, particularly the Continentals under Nathaniel Greene, who had taken command of the Southern Department after Gates's disastrous flight from Camden. Greene and Morgan had never met in person before the Southern campaign, yet they formed an almost instinctive partnership. Greene, a Pennsylvania-born Quaker who had risen to high command despite his religious pacifism, possessed a strategic vision that complemented Morgan's tactical brilliance perfectly. Where Morgan excelled at rapid maneuvers and pitched battles, Greene understood the larger chess game, how to use space, time, and information to wear down an enemy far superior in numbers. Together, they executed what many historians now recognize as one of the most sophisticated military campaigns of the entire Revolutionary War. The path from Cowpens to victory was not a straight line. There would be more battles, more retreats, more desperate moments when the outcome hung in balance. But the psychological transformation that began at Cowpens rippled outward in ways that no British general had anticipated. In the weeks following the militia victory, volunteers began enlisting again. Families that had wavered in their support of the Continental cause began to reconsider. Communities that had accepted British occupation began to resist more actively. The British narrative, that they were an irresistible force, that resistance was futile, had been shattered by farmers with rifles. Wait, before we continue deeper into what happened next, I need you to hold something crucial in your mind for a moment. This entire story, from Morgan's bold decision to stand and fight, to the militia's devastating tactics, to Cornwallis's reaction and what it meant for the broader campaign, all of it hinges on understanding the deeper principles of how underdogs defeat superior forces. Our complete in-depth guide on forgotten commanders and the tactical genius that changed American military history is available right now in the description and pinned comment. It breaks down the patterns, the signals, and the psychological mechanisms that explain not just Cowpens, but why the American militia were so devastatingly effective throughout the Revolution. This guide goes much deeper than what we can cover here in the video. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the American Revolution is the role of militia versus Continental regulars. For generations, American history has told a story that emphasizes the Continentals, the men who endured Valley Forge, who fought in organized units, who represented the real army of the Revolution. There is truth to that story, but it is an incomplete truth. The militia were not second-class soldiers. They were a different kind of soldier entirely. They understood terrain, they were naturally accurate marksmen from a lifetime of hunting, and they understood the political and social dimensions of warfare in a way that no European professional could match. The British came to understand this distinction only through bitter experience. Every report that came back from the Carolina frontier described the same phenomenon. American militia could move through the countryside with ghost-like efficiency, could strike without warning, and could vanish before a response could be organized. They were not bound by the logistics that chained the British Army. They did not require supply trains stretching back to the coast, they did not need rigid supply lines, and they could live off the land in ways that European soldiers could not comprehend. When you add to this the fact that militia were fighting in their own territory, defending their own homes and families, the advantages become almost overwhelming. By early spring of 1781, nearly 6 months after Cowpens, the cumulative effect of Morgan's campaign was becoming apparent even to the most optimistic British commanders. Cornwallis had not been decisively defeated in a major battle, but he had not won the war either. His forces were spread too thin across the Carolinas, his supply lines were vulnerable, and the population that he had hoped would rise up in support of the crown remained largely hostile or indifferent. Most critically, his army was bleeding men. Disease, desertion, and combat losses meant that his force was smaller now than it had been 6 months earlier, while American forces in the South were actually growing. Cornwallis made a decision that would shape the final year of the war. He decided to abandon the Carolinas and march north into Virginia, hoping that by moving to more densely populated territory and linking up with forces already operating in the state, he could regain the initiative. It was a calculated gamble, and it ultimately led to Yorktown, the siege where British forces would be trapped between the Continental Army under Washington and the French fleet, leading to the surrender that effectively ended the war. Yet none of that happens without Cowpens. None of that happens without Morgan's victory breaking Cornwallis's strategy and forcing him into a reactive posture. The men who fought at Cowpens paid a price for their victory that extended far beyond that single day. Many of Morgan's militia would continue to serve in other campaigns. Some would see action at other engagements. Some would sustain injuries that haunted them for the rest of their lives. A significant number would die of disease or in subsequent combat. Yet something fundamental had changed within them as a result of standing against Ferguson and his loyalist force. They had proven to themselves that they could stand against professional soldiers. They had proven that courage and determination could overcome discipline and superior resources. That knowledge transformed them from a scattered collection of local militia into something more unified and confident. After the war ended in 1783, most of these militia soldiers returned to their homes and their ordinary lives. Some became merchants, some continued farming, a few went into politics or military service in the new United States Army. The vast majority simply disappeared into the fabric of American society, their names lost to all but local historians and genealogists. Few national monuments were erected to commemorate them. Few histories centered their contributions. The grand narratives of the American Revolution focused on Washington, on the Continental Army, on the formal military structures that became the foundation for the Republic. The militia were treated as a supporting cast, important perhaps, but ultimately secondary to the real story. Yet this erasure from popular memory should not diminish what these men accomplished. The militia system that proved so effective in the Revolution became one of the foundational elements of American military doctrine. The idea that a free people could organize themselves for defense, that they did not need to rely on a standing army of professional soldiers, that civilians could become warriors when the moment demanded. All of this emerged from the experience of men like Morgan and his frontier militia. The Second Amendment to the Constitution itself reflects this conviction, the belief that an armed citizenry was essential to maintaining a free republic. The legacy of Cowpens extended even into American military thinking about irregular warfare and small unit tactics. The concept of fighting an enemy with superior numbers by using mobility, terrain, and superior marksmanship, this became a template that American forces would employ again and again in subsequent conflicts. When American fighters confronted British regulars in subsequent wars, when American soldiers adapted to fighting in jungles and mountains and difficult terrain, they were drawing on lessons first clearly demonstrated at Cowpens by Morgan's militia. The underdog farmer with a rifle became, in some sense, the archetypal American warrior. In the immediate aftermath of Cowpens, Morgan recognized that he needed to preserve his victory's psychological impact while avoiding overconfidence. He understood, perhaps better than any other American military figure of his time, the fragile nature of militia morale and the importance of maintaining momentum. He did not rest on his laurels. Instead, he continued to maneuver, to threaten British positions, and to coordinate with Greene's continental forces to create a unified strategic pressure that the British could not match. By the spring of 1781, the British presence in the South was contracting rapidly. Outpost after outpost fell or was abandoned. The Southern Loyalists, who were supposed to have risen up to support the Crown, instead watched as the tide turned against the British. Many switched allegiances or simply tried to maintain a low profile, waiting to see who would ultimately prevail. The entire British strategy for winning the war in the South had collapsed, not because of a single dramatic moment, but because of the cumulative effect of successful resistance beginning with Cowpens and continuing through months of relentless American pressure. Morgan himself would not remain in the South for much longer. By mid-1781, he was suffering from the accumulated effects of years of military service, arthritis in his joints, old wounds that never fully healed, the general deterioration that comes from a life spent in the field. He requested permission to return to the North, and this was granted. His last major contribution to the war would be his role in coordinating the siege operations around Yorktown. Though his presence was more advisory by that point, his health too compromised for active field command. The evacuation of British forces from Charleston came in December 1782, nearly 3 years after Clinton's triumphant arrival and nearly 2 years after Cowpens. British soldiers, many of whom had spent the entire Southern campaign living under the tension of guerrilla resistance and militia raids, finally departed. They carried with them the knowledge that their attempt to pacify the South through a combination of military force and loyalist militia had failed. The strategy that had seemed so promising in 1780 had been undone by the willingness of frontier militia to stand and fight. The Peace of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally recognized American independence. The militia who had fought at Cowpens and in countless smaller engagements throughout the Revolution had helped to make that peace possible. Most would never receive formal recognition for their service. No statues would rise in their honor in the early years of the Republic. No annual celebrations would commemorate their deeds. Yet their contribution was woven into the very fabric of American military identity and into the political philosophy that informed the Constitution and the nation itself. What happened at Cowpens on January 17, 1780, should have echoed through American consciousness the way Lexington and Concord did. It should have been taught in every schoolhouse. It should have been painted on tavern walls. Instead, it faded. The names of Morgan, Washington, and the officers who stood on that ridge were preserved in official records, but the men themselves, the farmers, the backwoods hunters, the neighbors who rode out together without orders, without promises of pay, without the certainty that their sacrifice would be remembered, those men became ghosts in their own story. This is the revelation I promised you at the beginning of this video. The real secret was never about tactics or terrain, or the genius of Daniel Morgan, though those things mattered profoundly. The true secret, the thing that changed the course of American history and has been buried under layers of time, was this. The American Revolution was not won by generals in continental uniforms commanding disciplined armies. It was won by ordinary men who understood something that no empire could crush out of them. They understood that a free man fighting for his home, his family, and his freedom is worth 10 professional soldiers fighting for a king he will never see and a cause he does not truly believe in. Cornwallis understood this too, in his own way. After Cowpens, he drove his army deeper into North Carolina, pursuing Morgan and his militia. But something had broken. His army had been defeated not by superiority of training or equipment, but by courage rooted in something deeper than obedience to a crown. He continued to campaign, won battles, occupied territory, but he could not occupy the hearts and minds of the people. Every victory was hollow because it did not settle the fundamental question: could an empire of distant lords rule men who had tasted freedom and stood together on the ridge? The campaign that followed Cowpens would eventually lead Cornwallis to Yorktown, where he would be surrounded by American forces and French allies. In October 1781, he would surrender his entire army, not because of superior American generalship alone, but because the spirit that Morgan had unlocked at Cowpens had spread throughout the South. Men who had fought at Cowpens, men who had witnessed what organized militia could accomplish, carried that knowledge with them. They spoke of it in whispers. They wrote it in letters. They told their sons about the day they stood on a ridge with ordinary farmers and broke the back of a professional army. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the war was effectively over. Yes, skirmishes would continue. Yes, negotiations would drag on for months. But the outcome was decided. The British Empire, the greatest military power on earth, had been forced to acknowledge the independence of a nation born in the vision of men who believed that government should answer to the people, not the other way around. That belief had been forged on ridges and in forests. It had been tested in blood. It had been proven true by farmers with rifles. In the years after the Revolution, Daniel Morgan became a celebrated figure. He received lands, a pension, and the respect of the new nation he had helped to birth. Washington himself sought his counsel, Congress honored him, he lived to see the Constitution ratified, lived to see the first president sworn in, lived to see the institutions of the new republic take root. He died in 1802, secure in the knowledge that his name would be remembered. But the nameless militia, the hundreds of men who had ridden to Cowpens because a neighbor asked, because conscience demanded it, because they understood in their bones what freedom meant, they faded. Some were honored in their own time by their communities. Many were not. They received no pensions, no lands in the new territories, no formal recognition beyond the knowledge they carried privately that they had stood when standing mattered. Their children and grandchildren knew the story. Their towns remembered. But the nation, as it grew and industrialized and turned its eyes westward, began to lose track of them. This is what we have lost by forgetting them. We have lost the understanding that revolution is not the province of great men alone. It is the calling of ordinary people who are willing to risk everything for something they believe in. We have lost the recognition that the American experiment, the bold idea that free men could govern themselves without a king, without an empire, without someone else making their decisions for them, was paid for in full by people whose names we will never know. The militia tradition did not die with the Revolution. It lived on through American history. In the War of 1812, militia units stood alongside regulars and held the line when British forces invaded. In the Civil War, citizen soldiers from North and South fought with a ferocity born from personal conviction. In both world wars, Americans mobilized not because they had standing armies waiting in barracks, but because millions of ordinary citizens, farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, students, understood that something greater than themselves was at stake and they were willing to fight for it. The lesson that Morgan understood, and that the militia at Cowpens proved with their courage and sacrifice, was this: you cannot occupy a people who have tasted freedom. You cannot hold down men who have stood together and discovered their own strength. An army of free men, even if untrained and poorly equipped, fighting for something they believe in, will defeat a professional army fighting for distant glory and a cause that does not touch their hearts. This truth has been tested across centuries and across continents, and it has held firm. Today, we live in a nation that owes an enormous debt to men whose names we do not know. We inherit institutions, rights, and freedoms that were purchased with the blood and sacrifice of ordinary people who had every reason to stay home, tend their farms, care for their families, and let others fight the battles. Instead, they rode out. They stood on ridges. They faced trained soldiers with superior equipment and steadied their hands and pulled their triggers. They refused to break. They refused to surrender. They refused to accept that an empire had the right to tell them how to live. It is easy to take freedom for granted when you have always had it. It is easy to forget that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the elections we participate in, the ability to criticize our government without fear of execution, all of these things are not natural or inevitable. They are the result of choices made by people who understood the alternative and chose freedom anyway. The militia who came to Cowpens understood this. They saw it, they lived it, they died for it. When we forget the militia, we forget what it means to be American. We forget that this nation was not handed to us by kings or granted by benevolent rulers. It was seized by ordinary people who had the courage to stand against an empire. We forget that the most powerful defense of freedom is not a standing army, important as those are, but the willingness of free people to stand together when the stakes demand it. This is what the militia of farmers proved at Cowpens, and this is what we must not forget. Freedom belongs to the people who are willing to stand for it. Not to generals alone, not to politicians, not to empires, but to ordinary men and women who understand in their deepest hearts that some things are worth more than safety, comfort, or the approval of a distant king. That is the militia. That is the American tradition. And that is the revelation that history has tried to bury, but can never truly hide. The story of Cowpens is the story of America itself. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that someone else has the right to rule them. It is the story of what courage looks like when it is stripped of pomp and ceremony and reduced to its essence. A man standing in line with his neighbors, facing an enemy, and choosing not to break. Every generation of Americans has inherited this legacy. Every generation has had the choice to live up to it or to let it slip away. The question that faces us now, in this moment, in this year, is whether we will honor that legacy by remembering it, learning from it, and teaching it to the next generation. The militia at Cowpens did not know their names would be forgotten. They did not fight for statues or for pageants held in their honor. They fought for something as simple and profound as the right to determine their own destiny. That right, that privilege, is what we possess because they fought. Not because they were heroes in the mythical sense, but because they were human beings who understood that some things matter more than your own safety or comfort. Take that lesson with you, not as an abstract principle, but as something real and applicable to your own life. Are there things you believe in strongly enough that you would risk comfort for them? Are there values you would stand for even if no one else did? Are there principles you would teach to the next generation, not because they are popular, but because they are true? The militia of Cowpens answered those questions with their lives. The question we face now is simpler. Will we remember them? Will we honor their sacrifice not with statues, but with understanding? Will we pass their story on, not as historical fact, but as an eternal reminder of what it means to be free? Every time you enjoy the freedoms that define this nation, the right to speak your mind, to worship as you choose, to vote, to assemble, to pursue your own vision of happiness, remember that those freedoms were purchased by people you will never know. Remember that the price was not paid once at the signing of the Declaration or the ratification of the Constitution. It is paid every day by people who choose to stand for something greater than themselves. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you found this history meaningful, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of forgotten courage. And if you have your own family history connected to the Revolutionary War, the militia tradition, or the struggle for American independence, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. These stories matter because they are not just history, they are a part of who we are. Thank you, and I will see you in the next